great to see everyone, and welcome to Covering the White House, hosted by and produced by the Karsh Institute of Democracy and the Miller Center. I'm Bill Antholis from the Miller Center, and on behalf of our board, our staff, our faculty, we're really thrilled to work with Karsh. We study the presidency at the Miller Center. We conduct oral histories of past presidential administrations, and we help unlock the secret Oval Office recordings. But we don't just study the past. We work with scholars, practitioners, and journalists to address pressing national challenges. Over the last 2 days, the Miller Center hosted an extraordinary and diverse group of practitioners, academics, and distinguished journalists to examine what's working in the presidency, what's not working, and what we can do about it. We've worked with White House reporters since our founding. They've helped guide our research, they've joined our events, and they've even served on our board, from Bob Woodward to Jim Lehrer to Ann Compton to John Harris. We share a mission of understanding and explaining the central role that the presidency plays in our democracy. Journalists explain what our presidents and other senior federal appointees are doing. Journalists also help us hold those officials accountable, and they all help us navigate through crises, wars, recessions, impeachments, pandemics, contested elections. Joining us today to discuss their experiences covering the inner workings of the White House are a dream team of distinguished journalists. Elena Plott-Calabro is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Previously, she covered politics and the 2020 election for the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, and was a staff writer at The Washingtonian. Mike Emanuel is the chief Washington correspondent for the Fox News Channel and co-anchor of Fox News Live. He was White House correspondent during the George W. Bush presidency and has provided live coverage of numerous critical national and international events, including the January 16, 2001 attack on the U.S. Capitol, presidential elections, and both impeachments of President Donald Trump. Laura Barone-Lopez is the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, where she covers the Biden administration for the nightly news broadcast. She is also a CNN political analyst. Previously, she was a White House reporter and covered the 2020 election for Politico. I'm sad to report that Peter Baker from the New York Times was unable to join us tonight. Peter had to stay in D.C. covering the events going on there. He sends his regrets. He promises to come back at a future date, and we hope that you will join us for that, and we'll work with Karsh to put that together. Lastly, I'm honored to introduce the moderator for this session, renowned journalist and a friend of the Miller Center, Judy Woodruff. Judy is a senior correspondent Judy is a senior correspondent and the former anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. She has covered politics and other news for 5 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS, has covered every presidential election and convention since 1976. I can't think of a more qualified person to lead this conversation. So please give a warm welcome to our panel.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill Antholis.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Bill Antholis. It's been a wonderful series of sessions that we've been privileged to sit in on for the last few days. And thank you to the Karsh Center for what you're doing. This is such an important conference that the University of Virginia is hosting, and it's just it's been not only fascinating but such a privilege to be here and to be part of it, and to be hearing from practitioners and thinkers and writers, the folks who advance knowledge in this field, these fields that we are thinking about. So for me, it's been such a treat to be here the last 24, 48 hours, and I know it continues into the weekend. So glad to be here with these extraordinary journalists. I'm sorry it's such a quiet time in American politics and, of course, tragically on the international scene as well. But that's exactly where I want to begin. You all cover Washington, cover the White House. Mike, you've covered the White House, as we heard during President George W. Bush, during the Obama administration. I'm going to start with you. I mean, tell people what it is like to cover the White House. There's no such thing as a typical day. Every single day is different. Laura's already nodding.
Yes.
And I know this from having covered the White House during, it wasn't the McKinley administration. Did he say 5 decades or 50? I don't know. But from covering the Carter administration for 4 years, covering a few years of the Reagan presidency, I did get a taste of both a Democratic and a Republican administration. But of course, it was before the days of, it wasn't quite the Pony Express, but it was before the days of cable television. Cable was just getting off the ground. And it was certainly before the days of the internet, social media. So we are in a completely different period right now. But 24/7 applies. And Mike, tell us, not just what covering the White House is like on a quote-unquote typical day, but what is it like at a moment like this? You cover Washington right now.
Yes.
And news is breaking all the time in the Middle East. It's been happening in Ukraine, and now you have the events of this week at the presidency, on the Hill, and just pulsating throughout Washington.
Well, you have to be quick on your feet, right? Because you could be doing day after day coverage of the economy, or relations between the White House and Capitol Hill, or the war in Ukraine, and then something tragically blows up. And so all of a sudden you have to be a quick study to figure out the latest on Middle East relations, remind the audience who Hamas and Hezbollah are. And so it's a never-ending challenge. You always have to be fast on your feet. I remember with President Bush, I would go to Crawford, Texas a lot since I'd covered him in Texas, and inevitably we were down there and something would blow up over the Christmas break, and we would have to jump into action, react to the news of the day, and be articulate about it in a hurry. And so it's the professional challenge of a lifetime covering the White House, no doubt about it. Incredible honor to travel aboard Air Force One, to be in the briefing room every day, to go into the Oval Office, to do live reports from the North Lawn. I mean, as the grandson of immigrants, what a country. I'm so grateful for the opportunities I've had, and grateful to be with all of you tonight.
I know that's how all of us feel. Laura, what about you? I mean, you were with Politico before you joined the NewsHour. Very grateful to have you as our White House correspondent. As Bill mentioned, you also do political reporting analysis for CNN. But what's it like? I mean, you are responsible for sharing everything that you can possibly learn of importance from the White House 7 days a week. What is a typical day like? And especially right now, since what happened 13 days ago in Israel.
Well, as you mentioned, Judy, it's, and as you mentioned, Mike, no day is the same. Every day is different. And when I was at Politico, I covered the Biden White House intersection of White House's relationships with Capitol Hill. I still do that to a degree for NewsHour. But, just for one example of what my day was like yesterday, we decided that I, along with our foreign affairs correspondent, Nick Schifrin, who had just returned from overseas, we were going to be doing special reporting coverage all around the president's speech that night. So who do I call? All day long, I'm on the phone with either administration officials, some of my sources on Capitol Hill, as well as people who maybe worked with President Biden in the past, who can give me a little bit more insight into what he's thinking about right now in this moment. To really provide to the viewer this holistic, as much information as possible, and as accurate information as possible. And And so we were actually on NewsHour, I think one of the first outlets to report what the president's national security package was going to be when he sent it to the Hill. And that was partially from leveraging my Hill sources, because one thing about this White House compared to maybe some other ones is that they are a tighter ship and they don't leak as much as other White Houses.
Bummer.
Yeah. And so some of my best sources are actually, I covered Congress for years prior to moving over to covering the White House, when I was at Politico as well as when I was at other outlets in D.C. And some of those Democratic sources or Republican sources on the Hill are some of my best sources when it comes to then approaching the White House and trying to get more out of them and holding them accountable and figuring out what they're doing. But that's one day, which was a very long night and a very... Go ahead.
When you say a long day, we're talking about what time in the morning and what time going to sleep at night?
Well, as soon as I wake up, I start working. Right. So right. I may not be, I may still be in my pajamas, but as soon as I wake up, my phone is in my hand. I'm looking at if sources have emailed me overnight, who I need to email, if something developed that I missed. And immediately start sending emails. Then we have our 9 a.m., and that's probably around 7 a.m. or earlier. And then around 9 a.m., we have our morning editorial meeting. And then we figure out what is going to be on the show that day. And then from there, I'm set off, which is either to prepare for a report that I'm going to give to one of the anchors that we're going to have a back and forth to inform the viewer. Or I may be conducting my own interview for NewsHour, which I did also after the start of the Israel-Hamas conflict, where I interviewed a disinformation expert because we had an entire segment about the fact that disinformation was rampant on social media after Hamas attacked Israel, what that does, how it contributes now to the fog of war, which is something that I don't know if all of us have fully experienced to this degree before. Yeah. So, yeah, and then I wasn't done officially until 9 p.m., and then I still worked a little bit after that.
Well, I watched you all on the air last night from 8 to 8:30, so I know where you were between 8 and 8:30, but that's not the end of your day.
No.
Elena, you're in a somewhat different situation. You're covering the White House for The Atlantic. Your deadlines are different than they are for either for Mike or for Laura. Tell us what a typical day, week is like for you, and especially at a time like this.
Well, I'll start by echoing some of what Laura said. Covering Congress was really, I think, the best foundation for me as a White House reporter. And to this day, I am talking with sources on Capitol Hill that I first met maybe 5 years ago. And just covering any White House, I think having that grounding is really, really important. And also what I learned is it's not necessarily the members themselves, but the staffers, the chief of staff, because a lot of times they're really the ones doing the work anyway. But I'll never forget how my very first day as a reporter was the day that Paul Ryan, you might remember, it feels like ancient history at this point, launched his conditional bid for Speaker to succeed John Boehner. And I remember thinking, why does everybody say Capitol Hill's boring? Like, this is the greatest thing ever. And then, 6 months later, I was like, I can't breathe. I just kind of drowning. But that sort of activity, I think, is great, whether you end up going into magazine reporting or daily beat reporting. What's interesting about magazine writing, and I think sort of a unique challenge, is I will often start reporting for a monthly magazine story 7 months before it even publishes. So really in those last few weeks, when you're technically going through copy edits and fact checking, you're trying to incorporate as much that is happening in that moment into the piece, up until press time. And I remember working on a profile for GQ of former Secretary of the Interior, Ryan Zinke. And days before it was supposed to ship to the printer, Trump unceremoniously fired Reince Priebus as his chief of staff, just texting him from the tarmac. And not in person, just we're leaving you at the airport. I wish you well, goodbye. And the context of my piece was such that who was chief of staff at the time was pretty important. I remember sitting in a coffee shop just being one day, I need one day for Donald Trump just to not do anything. Just like stay still until my story comes out, please God. That didn't happen, but
No, good luck.
but it really is like those last several days before you ship a piece off, you're trying to add any line that's like, no, we're aware that things have happened since the 7 months ago that I started reporting this story.
What is your lead time from how many days between when you have the absolute final word or sentence in your piece and when it
goes online? Often 2 weeks. So luckily they will put pieces online like well before they hit the print issue and that issue reaches people's mailbox. That can change depending on, the news is such that this piece will perform better if we put it up like right after we ship it. Other times it's a bit more evergreen and it's like, we can kind of let this simmer and like actually wait and plot out the perfect moment.
So, Mike, I want to come back to something I think all three of you have touched on, and that's sources.
Yeah.
A lot of people, they think, you're covering the White House, so you must be just talking to people inside the White House. That's not the way it works.
Not at all. You're only as good as your sources. And so if you're thinly sourced, your reporting is not going to be very good. And so working Capitol Hill angles, working former administration officials, working former members of Congress,
Right.
Insiders who maybe are not directly on the inside, but have plenty of experience, have plenty of relationships, and maybe somebody on the inside tells them that this is happening. So you call them and say, what's cooking? And they say, well, he's going to nominate so-and-so for this post, or he's about to fire somebody, or he's about to announce an aid package. And so if you can get that one source and then find a second source to tell you you're heading in the right direction, then you're in pretty good shape. But these days there's so much pressure with the speed of things.
Yeah.
Social media. You like social media, Laura?
No. I'm the rare millennial who does not like social media.
Well, I'm with you. I'm not a millennial, but I'm with you. So social media has sped things up even faster. And so there will be people, on the assignment desk or whatever that see a tweet and they go, hey, is
I
this...
think it's an X now, maybe.
Forgive me.
Right.
Keeping
See,
you
we're
up to date.
bad.
Yeah.
See, I went old school, sorry. But, for a while there, it was like any Yahoo with a laptop could be putting out stuff acting like they know. And so I just think old school journalism, great sources, double checking, don't go with the first source you have, make sure you've got two sources telling you you're onto it, is as critical as ever.
And Laura, what about that? And you mentioned sources. You started out by talking about staying in touch with sources. How hard is it? I mean, for people who don't know about reporting, how do you build up those sources? And especially when you're covering the most, you could arguably say the busiest place on the planet, the most important building on the planet, to the extent the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world. How do you make sure that your sources are people you can count on?
So, some of the sources that I have within the administration are people that I've known for years because they either, before they went into the administration, they worked in Congress, they worked, on campaign arms, they worked for think tanks, they worked for all these different pieces of the larger government apparatus and DC that influences the government apparatus. So, and making sure that you stay in touch with those people throughout their careers as you advance in yours.
Right.
Yes, I mean, getting coffees with them, having face-to-face meetings with them is incredibly important. Not just building a phone relationship with them. So that way they can get to know who you are. Now, you still keep that line. I've never become friends with any of my sources, and I know some reporters who have.
Right.
In DC, and I don't think that that's appropriate. But you build a relationship over years and you stay in touch with them over years, and you start to realize which ones you can trust and which ones you can't trust.
Right.
And there are certainly sources who, if you are lying to me on record and then only telling me the truth on background, then I'm not going to really use you anymore.
Right.
I'm not going to talk to you anymore.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I've had sources like that that are Democrats and Republicans that have done that to me. So I think that it really is a lot of just being there, constantly talking to them, reminding them that you exist as a reporter, that you're someone that they can trust, but you also need to be able to trust them.
Right.
Demonstrating that when you write your pieces, when you're reporting on air, you know, I'm not giving away who my sources might be if they need to be anonymous. So I think that's what, and it is harder, you know, coming from covering Congress to then covering and campaigns. I've covered a few election cycles, 2016, and then midterms, and then 2020, to now this specific White House. This White House is very difficult to break into. If you, and I've been in DC for a decade, but if you haven't been a reporter who's been around even longer than that, this White House can be incredibly difficult.
Do you find that, Elaine? I mean, I was going to say some of the things about sources are sort of the eternal truths. I mean, what Laura's saying is very much the way it was when I was in Washington, especially staying in touch with people on the Hill, people throughout the city and even the country who formerly worked in Washington or who were connected with people in Washington. But what about you? I mean, how hard is this White House to cover?
It is hard, and I think a pretty fundamental difference between this White House and the Trump administration is the Trump administration really liked to negotiate through the press. So you often had people like, you know, Gary Cohn and another staffer in the White House who had opposing views on an issue, but the way they'd want to get the president's attention and to kind of warm to their side was to go to someone in the press to kind of like report on the feud and, you know, cozy up to that reporter as a source so that ideally they would write more favorably. And I think that agenda was something, I think for anyone to cover the Trump White House successfully, that agenda had to be top of mind. I mean, if somebody is coming to you with information, there's always an agenda, right?
Sure.
It's not just because they're being like altruistic and like, I want to get you a Pulitzer. And that is like my goal when I wake up every day. It simply never is. So trying to suss out motives is pretty key. And I think in the Trump administration, you just had to be, you had to treat everything kind of like a tripwire in that respect. Like, why is this person actively coming to me with this? The Biden administration, you're not going to see people like actively approach you with a tip, in large part because to a certain degree, the inner circle in the West Wing doesn't like fiercely hate each other like they did in the Trump era. There's not like a kind of like Steve Bannon, Reince Priebus, like polar opposites thing going on. So, I mean, for us, in terms of like getting information, it's kind of great when people hate each other. As a citizen, I have to step back and think maybe it's good that they work well together in the West Wing.
Yeah, they're not offering you tidbits to undermine
Exactly.
I think also
one another.
Yeah, and I think also to Elena's point, when President Biden and his team, and I don't know if Louisa Terrell is in the audience right now, but when they were trying to get past the bipartisan infrastructure bill or the Inflation Reduction Act or anything like that, the fact that they didn't really leak that much, and they know, because maybe he's a creature of Congress and of the Senate, they know that the Congress leaks.
Oh, yeah.
Senators as well. So
Big time.
they big time leak. So they would not. Some of my best sources on the Hill were like, they haven't told us anything yet. And that's because this White House knows what happens.
Right.
And
Mike, you covered the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration. Compare what you're hearing, what is the case now with what was the case then in those two administrations.
Well, it's interesting because the Bushies would put out a statement, a paper statement, and sometimes they might even call you to follow up to make sure that you saw the statement. And then I went to the Obama years, and Twitter was becoming a thing. And all of a sudden, Robert Gibbs was putting out statements on social media, and I'm like, we got to watch that too, and now it's only gotten worse from there. And so, interesting to, infighting at a White House is not unusual. There are warring factions at times, people with different ideas about what the president should do. I think the Trump example was particularly serious infighting, but so I think what we're seeing today is it's a very fast news cycle. There's a lot happening. The ability to pivot from, okay, the president's talking about this, to all of a sudden breaking news somewhere. You just always have to be ready, always on alert, and knowing who to call. And I would like to pick up on something that Laura said, which is when you've been in Washington for a while, you realize that it's kind of a revolving door where, okay, so the Bush people left power and they took private sector jobs, and then when a Republican administration comes in, maybe you see them come back to a certain degree, or maybe they go to the Hill or to some other place to take a senior post. And so a lot of the faces you see in different places with different titles over time. So the relationship thing of your sources and making sure, that they know that if they ever burn you, they're dead. Why would I ever trust you again? And so there's a trust relationship built like any other relationship, but it's obviously critically important because the White House wants to put out what they want to put out on their time frame. And if you want to break news to get ahead of the story, you've got to find other people in the loop who can tell you what's happening.
Mm-hmm. What about this? I mean, what you all have touched on, the evolution of covering the White House from just the broadcast networks, cable, to a lot of cable, to the extent radio is a presence, and of course social media. You've already touched on it. I mean, how much do you, Elena? I'm going to come to you on this first. I mean, how much do you love, hate, worry about your obligation or not to worry about filing for social media? I know it's different because the Atlantic and the deadline is different, but how does that play into your thinking as you're reporting and gathering information?
Well, I mean, especially in previous jobs where I was doing beat reporting, I mean, it was a constant worry. Like, I'm 30 years old and I'm already getting grays colored like every 7 weeks, and I have no doubt that a large percentage of that has to do with Twitter. Because, often it's like when there are a lot of reporters covering the same thing. I mean, I remember times on the Hill when, I don't know, the Freedom Caucus would come out of a closed-door meeting and announce a decision that everybody had been waiting on that day. You're not waiting to put that decision out on Twitter when you actually have a link to your story, right? So you would see a lot of people in those really high-pressure moments on the Hill try to get out the information as quickly as you could, and you would say something like full story to come. And then that would become the thread that you were working off of. And as someone who does work now in magazines full-time, I have enjoyed the difference, because what I found working on the Hill is that even if I was good at getting like amazing information that nobody had, I would open up my laptop to a blank page and just be like, I'm just going to look at it like this for a while before anything happens. And I remember my editor saying, "You're not describing a sunset. Please just tell me what happened in that meeting." So writing on deadline has always been like a huge source of stress for me. I'm just like very bad at it. So having a little bit more time to like think about things at the sentence level is nice when you're at a magazine. But
wait a minute. Think about things. Okay.
Yeah. I recommend it for everyone occasionally. Think about things.
Laura, what about for you? I mean, you are reporting for the NewsHour, but you also, as you mentioned, you do work for CNN, and you've got to think about social media all the time.
Right. I mean, what that looks like in my given week is that for NewsHour, I may be reporting on Biden and the Israel-Hamas conflict, and then the president's push on Congress for Ukraine and Israel funding, but then, which I do also then report on CNN, but on CNN, because of the fact that I've covered Congress, because of the fact that I have Hill sources, they will also turn to me for reporting on the speaker's race. So it is a lot to juggle at times. Thankfully, at Politico, I did have to care a lot more about whether or not scoops were tweeted or X'd, on Twitter. And now at NewsHour, thankfully, thank you for contributing to me joining. We are much more about really getting the whole story to the viewer in terms of, not the palace intrigue as much. It's NewsHour. It's much more about what is the impact of what is happening on the Hill or what is happening in the White House on your everyday life. And so that's helped me be able to take a step back from social media and being a presence and a reporter on social media. Although, I do really feel as though sometimes Twitter for DC reporters is just all about trying to prove yourself to another reporter.
I was just going to say, it feels like you're reporting for other reporters.
Right,
and you have to be careful about
for
that.
your next job, and like for people high up, editors in chiefs or executives at other outlets that may be watching because they watch Twitter, and I don't like that. Yeah. And so I don't actually tweet nearly as much as I did when I first came to DC, when I was first on the Hill and I was like running around like everyone else. Yeah. And I think that my journalism is better for it that I'm not constantly concerned about social media or Twitter. Also, there's actually evidence to suggest that tweeting out your story or tweeting something on that platform doesn't actually drive viewers or readers to your full work and what you have reported out and what you've spent time on. So, yeah, I don't tweet that often.
Mike, what about you? I mean, you mentioned it a minute ago.
Well,
how much do you have to worry about all the platforms?
I feel like Grandpa saying, "Get off my lawn," because I was dragged into the social media era. I'm reluctantly there, but I think it's been a useful reporting tool just to see, like, what do other people have, and are there leads that I should be chasing that maybe I haven't been on. I do a little bit to promote, like if I'm anchoring a show or something like that. It may not drive a major audience, but it makes me feel better about being on the platform. And so I don't tweet as much as some of our colleagues do. I question the value. I also worry about if you don't select your words perfectly, it's impossible to put the toothpaste back in the tube. Like, once it's out there, look out. And so you might say, well, you do television. Well, I've done television for 30 years, and so I've figured out how to avoid hopefully saying the wrong thing. Hopefully I'm not saying the wrong thing right now. But the thing about social media is it can take off like a wildfire, so you really have to be precise with your words, and I'd rather not be bothered.
I've never regretted not tweeting.
Yeah.
I was never like, wow, that thing is, I wish I had tweeted about it. The world would be better. I've never thought that in my life. So that's something I always come back to. If I, like Laura, I tweet far less now in my job. A lot of that is just because with changes to the platform, it's simply not as useful anymore. Especially when I was covering the Hill, I mean, I'd get on and like the top reporters I'd follow would be right there. So if I missed a press conference or something, I could essentially like reload Jake Sherman's Twitter until I was getting like a readout of what happened. Now I log on and just see like, I don't know, people I've never heard of in my life with their hot take about Hamas or something. I'm like, I don't need that.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, after the third time that I had to apologize for something I tweeted because I got the year wrong or the name wrong or some item wrong. But then, of course, you have to correct it because you don't want anything out there that's at all not exactly correct. I thought, this is telling me something.
There's so many people in their mom's basement who are willing to say stuff to you on social media that they would never, ever say to your face. Yeah. And one time I responded to a guy and called him a bedwetter living in his mom's basement. And my agent called about 30 seconds later and said,
oh my God.
Mikey, what are you doing? You made that Trolls Month. Stop it.
Yeah, you can't engage.
Don't punch down.
Never feed
Yeah, you
it.
can't engage the trolls. I mean, and I on social media have received racist, sexist, tweets at me.
On social media?
I know. Who would have thought?
Who would have thought?
But yeah, don't tweet.
That's. I want that to sink in with everybody. What we're saying here about social media broadly. I mean, and there's also Instagram. There's TikTok. There's more. But I mean, Twitter is something that journalists follow a lot. Do you have time to think in your work? I mean, you touched on it, Elena. What about you, Laura? I mean, do you have enough time to think about what you're reporting?
Some days I do, and some days I don't. I think more now I am able to take a step back. And, NewsHour is a small shop. I'm the only White House correspondent. So when there is White House action, I have to be on it. But we don't cover every little thing the president does.
Right.
And so one thing that I've appreciated in my time now at NewsHour, which has been about a year and a half, is that I also am able to cover threats to democracy, which you've been doing as well, Judy, and far-right extremism, and the increase in political violence on the right. And I think that those pieces allow me to take a step back because it applies to this presidency. It applies to the election we're all about to cover.
Right.
And in that way, I wanted to add on the sources element. I talked to a lot of historians also. And I think more and more arming ourselves with the historical context is incredibly important as we cover this next election cycle. And when I'm able to do those pieces, I'm allowed to stop and think and see what the bigger picture is and try to make sure that we're really bringing the bigger picture and the stakes to the public. Because I've covered horse race. I've done horse race coverage. Mm-hmm. I don't want to do that in 2024. I don't think that actually serves the public. And I know I'm getting into more maybe this president's reelection bid, but...
and I want to get to the election in just a minute. Mike, what about you? I mean, do you feel you have time to...
So I covered the Pentagon for a period after 9/11. Was at the Bush White House, the Obama White House, did some time on the Hill as well. And so there are days in cable news where it's like hot what you're doing, and you've got hit after hit after hit. And so you're constantly, what's the new element? What moves it forward? And then we have like a special report with Brett Baer at 6 o'clock, like our newscast of record. And so sometimes you just have to find a few minutes to sit back and go, okay, we've been doing the incremental all day long, but like, what's the big takeaway from the day? And so it's really critical to find that and not just get caught up with what the thing was last hour, but like, if people have not been watching all day, if people have not been on dopey social media all day, what do they need to know about this huge story in Washington? And so just trying to carve out a few minutes just to be able to think clearly and how you're going to relay it in a clear and concise way to our audience.
Elena, as we said, you've got a different timeline, but you covered Washington for a number of years. Do you see, as you look around at your colleagues, at people, young reporters I mean, do you think in general the media is taking the time that it needs to think?
I think that any editor you talk to will proclaim that that's what they do differently from other publications. But I think what inevitably happens at times, and where I have seen conflict in newsrooms, was especially during the Trump era, it almost felt like there was this ambient pressure to make meaning of everything he tweeted because he was so active on that. And so I felt like during that time, even magazines like The Atlantic and The New Yorker, it felt like they had to have some sort of response or like build a story around a tweet that was just, kind of an innocuous misspelling of something. And I think that that tendency has gone down quite a bit, which I'm grateful for, because as nice as it can feel as a reporter to kind of put out something first and like see those retweets rack up, like I remember actively like how good that would feel. It has to come back to, in what way is this serving the public? And I think sometimes people, kind of get so enmeshed in their own newsroom ecosystems, and I think the kind of dangerous incentives that social media can provide for the work that you do, that, if you don't force yourself to step back and act with humility and say, did any of the work I do today elevate or shape some random reader's understanding of this country? And if you say no, which I think a lot of people by the end of the Trump era felt, maybe I didn't really do that. It's time for a paradigmatic shift.
Well, let's talk about the former president, because he's been on the scene as a national figure, looking at the presidency since 2015. He served in the White House for 4 years. He's been ever present daily in the news virtually since then, running for president now, leading in the polls. There's been focus on it during this conference the last couple of days at the Miller Center. Let me start with you, Laura, and all the accusations around what's factual and what isn't factual, what's true and what isn't true. How should reporters think about that? How do you think about it? As a White House reporter, you weren't covering the Trump White House, but you are covering this campaign, and the White House has to react to what the former president is saying and the people who support him are saying, not to mention what's going on the Hill right now. How do we as reporters, how are you as a reporter dealing with statements, assertions, some of which are not grounded in fact? And I'm not just attaching that to former President Trump, but it is a big question out there.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. And how we're going to cover 2024. And I'm a pro-democracy journalist. So the way I view this election cycle is that the biggest story is about democracy. And yes, there will be stories about the economy and stories about abortion, but the actual this actual campaign, the entire campaign that the former president is running is about grievance and being attacked by the federal government, being attacked by Washington, D.C., and continuing to lie about the fact that the 2020 election was stolen, and trying to lay the foundation to say that the 2024 election may be stolen as well. He's already doing that. He's called for suspending the Constitution. So that is the lens that I take entering this election cycle, and that I think that every interview that any of us conduct with any Republican or Democrat, there has to be at least one question about democracy, if not more. And I don't think that the Washington, D.C. press corps has actually adapted to that yet. I don't think that we should do horse race coverage. I think that entering this election cycle, it should be what are the stakes, not the odds. And we should cover Trump and President Biden as though what would the actual impact be of a second term for Biden or a second term for former President Trump? What would that actually mean in your everyday lives? What are they explicitly proposing? And really making very clear in direct language what the former president is saying he would do if he were to win the presidency again, which is to abolish the Department of Education, which is to gut the FBI, and what are the impacts of that, and which is to, install loyalists across the civil service and fire civil servants. That is what he has proposed. And what is the impact of that? I also think that Sorry, Judy, you were trying to jump in right here.
And you can pick up on that, but Mike, I do want to come to you on this question. I mean, how do you, as somebody who covers the city and all
Sure.
that's going on in Washington, as a senior correspondent at Fox News Channel, how do you see this election, and how do you see the assertions that are out there that can't be backed up by evidence versus everything else? I mean, how do you look at that as a reporter?
There's no doubt we have a fact-checking responsibility. We have to investigate everything that we're told and make sure that we're getting to the truth somehow. To be honest, I'm not convinced we're heading for Trump v. Biden 2.0. Call me skeptical about polling. Does anybody in here answer the phone these days? And I'm not disrespecting pollsters who are very, very smart and capable people, but I don't know how you get an accurate sample these days. I traveled in 2016 with Hillary Clinton's campaign. All the polls told us she was going to win. The day before Election Day 2016, Clinton staffers were asking us cool neighborhoods to live in D.C. It didn't happen. Even the exit polling 2016, catching people at the polls, told us that by 11 o'clock Eastern, we should be able to call the election for Hillary Clinton in a big night for the Democrats. And we're watching the returns. I'm sure you remember it very well, Judy.
Vividly, yeah.
You're like, what's going on? And then last year, we were expecting this red wave.
Yeah.
There was no red wave. And so I think if it is Trump v. Biden, I'm willing and ready to cover it. It'll be fascinating. I'm curious to see how often the current president's out on the trail, how many stops he's making a day. I'm curious the impact, because former President Trump's going to be spending a lot of time at courthouses in early next year.
Yeah.
So he's going to talk to the camera in breaks in the hearings and stuff like that. But what's the impact with voters? Do they say, you know what, I like some of his policies, but I don't want all the drama? I don't know. Like, I think, look at South Carolina. It's number 3 on the Republican side in the calendar. Nikki Haley's a former South Carolina governor. If she could pull out a win in South Carolina, isn't that what propelled President Biden to the presidency ultimately? He won in South Carolina, which changed everything. So we'll see. If it's Trump v. Biden, feel free to erase the tape. If it's not Trump v. Biden, you heard it here.
He'll take the credit.
Yeah.
And
Selective memory.
But my postscript, to what extent is it are reporters responsible for asking candidates who make assertions that are not grounded in fact, as in a number of the folks in the House of Representatives right now, including Jim Jordan, who was just trying to be elected Speaker, that the 2020 election was stolen.
Right.
To what extent is it the responsibility of reporters to challenge that and any other assertions?
I think there's no question you have to challenge that. And by the way, Judy, do you want to be House Speaker? Because there's an opening. You don't have to be a member of Congress to be the Speaker.
I think she could get you 17.
Yeah. But no, facts matter. We have to be honest with our audience. And we have to be chasing the truth, getting to the truth. Sometimes it's tricky because people have different versions of the truth. But that's why doing your old-fashioned reporting of checking with credible sources that you have relationships with to see, is this really happening or not? Is this spin or not? It's a fundamental aspect of what we do and what we need to do every day.
Elena, what about you? Same question.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this too, and I think one reason was that, so when I was at the New York Times for the paper as a national politics reporter, I loved covering congressional campaigns, even if it, if it's like a random backbencher from Long Island. I know that nobody's really reading that story. It's not making a huge splash when it comes out. But to have that sort of exposure to voters day in and day out, to me, is the most edifying experience you could have as a reporter. And I think a lot of times when you are based out of Washington with your reporter, as a reporter, if you're only going to Capitol Hill each day, what ends up happening, especially with Republican lawmakers, you talk to them and they say something on the record like, yeah, I'm skeptical about the 2020 election. But once you're off the record, they're like, I don't believe that. It's like carbon copy of that conversation would happen time and again. And I think, there was this sort of unfortunately popular tagline throughout the Trump era, which was take him seriously, but not literally. Maybe that applied to, a couple of lawmakers or whatnot. But for me, what was so edifying about getting out on the campaign trail was hearing how, maybe Trump himself didn't mean it literally. Maybe this one congressman didn't mean it literally, but his supporters were taking it that way. And seeing up close the ways in which, the tweets actually mattered to people who were listening to them. I mean, to me, that never became clearer than on January 6th. And I was very frustrated by, a select class of sort of like the Washington punditry who seemed so taken aback that something like that could ever happen. It's like, where have you been the past 4 years? Even if you were like buddy with the, senior administration officials who were like, never gonna happen. I mean, rhetoric matters. And I think there's been this long sense in Washington that it's just sort of like embroidery. But Trump showed us, and especially with his kind of use of social media, that people were hanging on to every word he said. And I mean, as somebody who's working on a book right now that includes things about the Alabama governor, George Wallace, I mean, he was so similar. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, I mean, it was so clear to civil rights activists that what had happened was white supremacists in Birmingham had listened to George Wallace and they had taken him at his word. And he was desperate for that to not be true. I mean, he would, go around house to house being like, do you think I caused this, even indirectly? Like looking for some kind of placation. But the fact is, like, words matter. People listen to them. There are extremists out there. And unless reporters make a point, I think, throughout this campaign to talk seriously with voters about how they're hearing what's being said, I think, I don't know how the cycle doesn't repeat itself.
If I could.
And how do you... And I'll come to you. I just want to say to all of you in the audience, you have an opportunity to submit questions. You see up on the screen, you can scan QR code, and those questions we're going to be choosing. Those questions will be chosen, and we'll be reading them, and the panel will tackle them. But Laura, yes.
Well, I just wanted to add to something that Elena was saying, which is that when you asked Judy about whether or not it's our job to confront people in power about the assertions that they make and whether or not they're true, I agree with Mike and Elena that yes, it is our job. Our job is to confront them because we are the watchers. We are the people that are making sure that what is presented to the public, be it on TV or in print or on radio, is what the truth is. And I do not believe in journalism that says, okay, let me count up how many Republicans I've quoted in this story and how many Democrats I've quoted in that story, and that's fairness. No. Did that story reflect the truth based on everyone I've spoken to, but also based on my history of covering Congress and what I know about Congress and how it operates, or my history of covering the presidency and what I know about how the presidency operates, and the historical context? And one kind of exercise, I guess, that I think about is when people will accuse me of not being objective, or will accuse reporters, which there's a lot of lately, of not being objective. Mm-hmm. Being objective is not being influenced by, not letting your personal feelings or people attacking you influence what you ultimately present to the public. So I'm not concerned about losing a source. If I'm worried about losing a source because I told the viewer the truth, well, then you're not going to be my source anymore. I'm not going to do access journalism. I did that for a bit earlier in my career because sometimes you have to make
Access journalism meaning what?
Access journalism meaning that you are just constantly talking to, who you cover, the institution, be it Republicans or Democrats or leadership, and you just get so much access to them that you start protecting the very people that you cover. I'm not here to protect lawmakers. I'm not here to protect President Joe Biden, and I'm not here to protect, candidate Donald Trump. I'm here to make sure that they're telling the truth and that the impact of their policies is understood by the everyday people and how it could harm them or not. And one of I'll get to the quick mental exercise that I play, is that, like, if I were a reporter in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, covering the lunch counter protests at Woolworths, would I have just written a story, which would maybe be called neutral, saying that those that did not want to allow these black people to be able to eat at that white-only counter they're states' rights. They just want states' rights, and we should stay out of their business and have that in the story alongside, the voices of those black protesters. And that would maybe be considered a neutral story, but it's not an objective story, and it's not the objective truth, which was that the actual motivations were based in racism and were based in oppression.
So this is a big subject. It's because we're touching on what is the role of a reporter? Is the role of a reporter to report the facts, take notes, and report that back, or is the role of a reporter to call balls and strikes, to say, okay, what I'm hearing doesn't jibe with what I know to be factual or fair, and therefore I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to get more information here or there. How do we, and we've only got a few minutes because I do want to start taking questions from the audience. Mike, how do you define what is the fair? I don't use the term objective because I don't think any human being can be objective. Yeah. We're not robots. We're not machines, computers. But how do you define the fair role of being a reporter?
Well, I think any story that I do has to contain various perspectives on whatever the issue is. Does it have to have 3 sound bites from one side and 3 sound bites from the other? No, it doesn't. But I think it's important to give our viewers and the TV perspective context of kind of the various arguments about a particular issue, and then for your live on-camera tag, maybe boil it down to what this all means or where the story is heading. Right. My approach may be different than Laura's approach. I respect her work, but I just try to get at different views so the audience has a sense of, here's what conservative Republicans may be arguing, here's what some on the left are arguing, and hopefully include enough different perspectives where people go, okay, I think I get an idea of the arguments around that particular issue.
Elena, do you want to weigh in? And then I'm going to take...
Yeah, I think to echo like a legend like Amanpour, she says, my job is not to be neutral, it's to tell the truth. And I just think that's something you have no choice as a reporter but to adhere to every day.
Except sometimes you don't know the truth. You're
trying to get it.
With what facts there are that day, and you may not know ground truth at any given moment.
If we don't, then I guess it's on us, right, to then make sure that the next day we get to the actual truth, or the day after that.
I think, as I've already said, I think to be a reporter requires a great deal of humility. And I think a lot of reporters, especially when they start out, they're so eager to kind of report and write a story that you might just, interview 12 people and think, well, that's it. But you have a brain. You know that whether after you've interviewed 12 people, you've gotten closer to the truth or not. And so being willing to take the time, be humble about what you do and do not know, I think is essential.
I think the being humble point is one that everybody here agrees, knowing that new information is presenting,
Absolutely.
is evolving every day.
Your job is not to protect your first version of a story. It's to make each subsequent one closer and closer to the truth.
We have questions, and I believe we have University of Virginia students who are here who are going to read to us, to all of us, what those questions that are coming in are.
All right.
Thank you, guys. My name is Adrian. I am a current master's student in statistics. And the question I have
This is going to be a tough question.
Sorry, it's no math. I promise.
All right.
Yeah,
But-
we're not good at math.
You guys all were speaking, I guess, against the use of social media, I guess, like not liking it a lot. But I do want to ask you guys have been on the field for so long. Knowing that, do you think the role of journalists will change in the next 5, 10, 20 years? Do you think artificial intelligence has already changed that? And even so, do you think that you guys should be using artificial intelligence already?
Okay, we're going to split that into two
yeah, that was
questions. One question being, how is journalism going to change in 5, 10, 20 years? All right, who wants to think that far out? Mike?
Yeah,
Well,
Mike, you can go for it.
I think in the TV world, we're trying to figure out
Yeah.
what his generation is going to consume for news. My kids don't sit in front of the TV really at all. Once in a while they may walk by and go, oh, there's Dad, and then keep going.
There's Dad.
Yeah. Oh, good.
How interesting.
Oh, good. He's working today. Good. We can eat. But I think there will be a change as we try to figure out how to bring serious information to the next generation in the manner that they want to receive it. And so I think we're heading for a huge transformation, and I think there are lots of executives all across the industry trying to figure out how do we do it.
Yeah, I younger people, and I'm young, but people younger than me,
Gen Z?
Gen Z, they seem to consume a lot of their news on YouTube, on TikTok, on social media like that. I'm not on TikTok. I probably should be. But also not necessarily from traditional news sources. They consume it from an influencer who consumed it from a traditional news source and then just almost reappropriate, aggregates that information and then explains it to them.
So these are not stories that were picked up from the NewsHour or the Atlantic or Fox.
They could have been. It's that there's then the influencers, or maybe I'm not using the correct term for what this person would be, but someone then who's of the more of the everyday public who has not been a journalist will take journalist information and then explain it to people on TikTok or on YouTube, and that is what younger generations are watching.
Can we call that stealing?
Yeah, it does feel like stealing. I don't think that I should be using artificial intelligence whatsoever when I'm writing my scripts. No, no. And if somehow outlets are, then they need to make that known and make that public so that way you as the news consumer knows that that journalist or that producer isn't the person that wrote that full script.
Well, their accuracy rate's not that good, right?
No.
I mean, I don't, Grandpa here, I don't know. But from what I've read and everything I've studied about it, it seems like you can get bad information from artificial intelligence too. So you really have to be careful, but not advocating we use it. I like the old-fashioned journalism.
You know, we hear it's going to do good things in the field of science and maybe medicine, and various other arenas, but what about journalism? But what about this question of how, I mean, Elena, how do you think the younger, I mean, are they going to have chips in their earlobes? I mean, how are they going to get their news?
Oh my God, I don't want to know. I had to ask my 13-year-old sister recently, how does one chat GPT? She was like, what are you talking, just chatgpt.com. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went on it, and actually I did it because I was asked to submit like my quick bio for this event, and I hate writing things like that. I was like, let me see if ChatGPT could do it for me. And what it spit back out was like, Elena writes engagingly about a variety of topics, and I was just like, no, it's not going to work for me. So I doubt that I will ever use it again. But another issue that I have with it is that a lot of writers who I really respect and admire and have published book length works. Their work is being used to sort of train Chat GPT without their consent. That's something I feel really strongly about.
I'm sure maybe some of the articles we've written are being used to train AI.
Maybe that's how they knew I write so engagingly. And
Yeah.
who knows?
About sunsets.
Next question. We have another student. In the dark.
Hello, my name is Joel Elliott. I'm a fourth year here at the University of Virginia, and I'm studying commerce and history.
Nice.
Our next question is, when reporting on foreign affairs, especially those conflicts that are multifaceted without a solidified stance from the White House, how do you stay away from being wishy-washy?
Wait a minute. Could you
understand.
just repeat the question?
Yes. When reporting on foreign affairs, especially those conflicts that are multifaceted without a solidified stance from the White House, how do you stay away from being wishy-washy?
When you're reporting on a complicated foreign
Yeah,
Conflict.
international story,
exactly.
how do you, I mean, in other words, when the information coming in is spotty, you don't have the whole story, you're still learning what's going on in the earliest hours. For example, what's happened in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Mike, I mean, it happened early in the morning on a Sunday.
Well, we have the perfect example of the explosion near the hospital in Gaza.
And that's the example.
Yes.
There is a fog of war that is occurring that social media has made worse, which, like I said earlier, we did an entire discussion on NewsHour about talking to, a disinformation tech expert about the dangers of that, about how easy it is for bad information to spread like wildfire. I think at NewsHour, we've just been very careful. We're not going to go off of one report. We're going to wait until we get all of the information possible to make sure that what someone is alleging, which in the first instance was that this was an Israeli strike,
Right.
is accurate. And clearly there have been mistakes already made in the last 2 weeks, week or so, by press, rushing to declare what something was when it didn't happen that way.
And some elected officials, too.
And
jumped
some
on
elected
it.
officials, yeah. Right now, this White House does have a very specific, very declarative stance. President Biden is staunchly behind Israel, but is also now starting to be, he's not changing his posture, but he's changing his rhetoric slightly, where he is trying to, in different ways, whether it was during his trip to Israel or also in his speech last night, make very clear and send signals and caution to Israel that they don't want a wider conflict and that they should abide by laws and rules of war, and that and the White House is desperately trying to ensure that civilian casualties are minimized.
It does make your job, Elena, Mike, more difficult when the information is coming in bits and pieces and it's early and you just don't know the whole story yet. And Elena, I come back to what you said about being humble.
I was going to say, I know I sound like a broken record, but another thing I've never regretted is waiting to be right on a story, even if I was like the 12th journalist to get it out there. What I have regretted are times, especially early in my career on Capitol Hill, when the adrenaline rush that comes with feeling like you're first, I mean, that will never outmatch the tremendous low of then realizing you got it wrong. And it's my goal every day to never feel that again. So
Amen.
Patience, I think, is essential in a moment like that.
Mike?
So the other night, there were reports coming out that there were protests in front of American embassies overseas. And 1983, the embassy in Beirut was bombed. So my bosses got anxious about, like, what do we know? And so there were some initial reports saying that the protesters were, like, right at the American embassy in Beirut. and that they had taken to the streets in other capitals across the Middle East. And so we were very meticulous to make sure before we went on the air with it, how close were they to the American embassy? And then it turned out they were in front of the French embassy and a United Nations facility. And so I think back to the point about humility, I think it's important to level with the audience about here's what we know. It's, the story is breaking.
We don't have all the answers.
We don't have all the
And it's not just
information.
abroad, it's with mass shootings here, too.
Right. No question.
Yeah.
We've got only about 3 minutes left before the end of the session, but I want to call on another student.
Hi, my name is Kyle Riopel. I'm a first-year master's student in the School of Leadership and Public Policy here.
Nice.
A lot of audience members have asked about this next question, so everyone on stage tonight has talked about how important it is to you personally to tell the truth. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where it seemed like your news organization was pushing an overall narrative that you thought wasn't true? How do you handle that?
Oh my God, I can't name names.
Well,
I'm going to act like a politician over here.
well, I'm comfortable saying in my 27 years at the NewsHour, 10, and then a detour at another news organization at CNN, and then came back to the NewsHour, I've never felt that I was being pushed in a direction. It's not to say that sometimes collectively
There's groupthink.
as you're beginning to understand a story, and people may have strong views about how we ought to be covering it, but I feel that this when it comes down to the individuals we've been fortunate to work with at the NewsHour, they've been people who have not wanted to rush to judgment, which is a blessing. It's an absolute blessing. Mike, I'm going to go to you next.
Okay. Oh, me first? Or
Okay,
not?
Laura.
Oh,
you
okay.
first. Whatever.
I mean, I have worked at places where the editors have definitely tried to push a certain narrative, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily what ended up in print. So when I was covering the 2020 campaign and I was in Arizona, I think there was groupthink that Trump was going to win Arizona still. And I was there and I was talking to a lot of voters. And thankfully, after multiple conversations with my editors, I told them, the evidence just isn't there. I think Biden is going to flip Arizona. And I ended up being right. But when you have an editor that really listens to you, then I think there's this good push and pull. They should press you for more information. They should, try to get you to make sure that every element of your story is, if you're going to make assertions or if you're going to say that a state, especially when you're covering politics, that a state appears to be trending one way or the other, that you have evidence to back that up. I also have worked for, I've worked for the Huffington Post. I worked for the Washington Examiner. You might hear those two names and say, the Huffington Post leans to the left and the Examiner leans editorially to the right. I will tell you that my writing across both of those two organizations and the way I approached journalism was exactly the same. And thankfully, surprisingly sometimes, across both of those organizations, those news outlets, yes, I did get into fights with editors, but at the end of the day, as a single reporter, you do have the ability to say, I'm not going to put my name on that. If you are going to insert this slant into my story, then I will not put, and it's not backed up at all, I'm not going to put my name on that. So I think there are pressures that exist in different newsrooms, and sometimes newsrooms succumb to groupthink, especially since, as a person of color, as a Latino, I'm often the only Latino in newsrooms that I've worked in, and or there's very few of us. And so that's a different diversity that I bring that also, newsrooms are still very much predominantly male and white, and they tend to have groupthink. So pressures like that do exist, but I think that newsrooms are getting better across the board.
Mike.
So I grew up in the era of watching Jennings, Rather, and Brokaw. And that era of news, Judy Woodruff, inspired me to want to hopefully see the world and tell stories. And so I was totally inspired as wanting to do the news, not to be an editorial page person. And so there are people who get paid for their opinions. I'm asked to play it straight every day, and my bosses will come to me and say, is your script fair? Do you think that script is fair? If it's fair, then let's go with it. If there's something else we need to weave in there to make it fair, then let's do that. And so I have not felt pushed in an ideological direction. We do have opinion hosts who are on in the evenings and are paid for their opinions, and but I am asked to play it straight, and I'm grateful for that because that's what I want to do.
Elena.
I have been pressured once in my career, or told rather. I had a story that was an unflattering one about a donor to the publication, as it turned out, and it was killed, and so I quit. So, it's like Laura said. I mean, at the end of the day, it's your name. It's your name. Nobody is ever going to know the backstory. Oh, well, she tried really hard to push back against this. I mean, nobody knows that. It's never your editor's name on the story. And so if that's not something you're comfortable with your name on, then you can simply not do it.
Or for us, it's our face.
Right, now it's my face.
Right.
We both are very scared.
Long live print, right?
Face, integrity, yeah.
Well, let's give the three of these amazing journalists. You guys were amazing, amazing.